space. And I think that's certainly good advice when it comes to relationships. Like ladies, if you've got a guy who is hurt, and we're just talking a little bit hurt, like the wind knocked out of him. It might be nice, rather than just rushing in right at that moment, to give him a little bit of space. Because how many right when that accident happens, maybe he gets the wind knocked out of him, or just kind of slips and trips a little bit. There's a moment there where he's not really saved, but he'll be saved again. Like he'll come back to his senses, but there's a little moment there where you're going to have to give him a little bit of grace to recollect himself. And so there's this, it's good advice to just say, give him some space, Or I was thinking last summer, I remember taking my boy fishing. And his form of like fishing and casting it's a little bit of like a combo between fencing and the Karate Kid. And so every once in a while, and I remember, as he's doing this, just kind of wildly casting. I remember telling people around, like, you need to give him a little bit of space. And everyone seemed to listen except for my wife, who, she didn't heed that advice, and as a result, though I got to say, Austin, he had the catch of the day. We didn't catch anything else, but Austin caught his mom. So, again, maybe ladies, you meet this guy and you're like, man, I don't know why it didn't work out. I don't know what happened. I think I scared him off. And it's like, well, what happened? Why did this happen? It's like, well, I don't know. Could it be that you hacked into his Facebook account and changed his relationship status to in a relationship without his knowing? Could be. Maybe it was that he saw you pinning a whole bunch of wedding dresses on Pinterest. It's the best thing you could do, ladies, in that situation is do what? Give him some space. And listen, I bring that up because when it comes to God, the same thing holds true as well. When it comes to God, doing the kinds of things that he wants to do in and through your life, the things he's promised to do in your life, it all hinges on whether or not you are willing to give him some space. But in saying that, when I say give him some space, we're not talking about giving him space through distance, but through obedience. We're not talking about pulling yourself away from him, but drawing nearer and drawing closer to God. Because as we're going to come to discover through the story of this wave maker that we're going to be looking at tonight, is that here's the thing: we can't make God move in our lives, but we can make room for him to move. We can make room for him to move. We can make some space for God to move and do the impossible and do what only he can do in our lives. And so to look at this and unpack this, we're going to look at a story in 2 Kings chapter 4. 2 Kings chapter 4, and we're just going to kind of break down these verses, and I'll give you a little bit of context as we kind of work through these verses. So starting in verse 1, it says, the wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord, but now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slave." So a little bit of context here. We see Elisha, a prophet. Remember a couple weeks ago we talked about Elijah. Elisha was sort of his follow-up. He was the one that Elijah passed the baton to, was this guy by the name of Elisha. And Elisha comes on the scene, and he comes onto the scene in this case, in the situation of this widow who's in a very desperate situation. And she's in a desperate situation. This is more, this desperation that she's going to, you got to understand, it's more than just being distraught because she just lost her husband. It's more than that. See, this was a time period, this was a time frame where if you were a lady and you lost your husband, you really, what happened was you lost your sole source of income. You lost your security. You lost your provision. There wasn't a way in that time period for ladies to really go out there. Like you couldn't just go out there and get a job, or you couldn't just go out there and start your own business. You didn't have that luxury. You were really dependent. This was a very male-dominated, male-driven society at that moment. And so you were out of luck if you didn't have if you didn't have a husband to kind of take care of that, you were really dependent on maybe a father or an uncle or a brother, and apparently she didn't have any of that extended network. So she was in a very dire situation. So basically, when we meet up with her in this story, she's got basically like the repo man who's showing up at her doorstep. And again, back in those times, this was more than just trying to take away your house or take away your car. Like if you owed a debt, you weren't able to pay your bills, they would take your kids. And some of you are like, well, if it must be, it must be. I'll make that sacrifice. But this is a big deal, obviously, for her. And so she's incredibly distraught. In fact, that text says she cries out to God. And that word cries out, it was a symbolic of a picture of a person in just utter desperation. How many of you know that there's almost a different kind of sound? When you're saying a prayer, giving a prayer out of true desperation, where God is your only hope, how many know it sounds different than just your normal everyday prayer? See, most of our prayers, they kind of have fallback plans to them, right? Like, God, I need you to come through. I need a miracle. But if you don't, you're thinking, you might not say it this way, but you're thinking in the back of your mind, but if you don't, I got the doctor waiting on call. I got my parents. I can move back into their house if it doesn't pan out. I mean, we kind of got our fallback plan. We wouldn't say it that way. And by the way, those aren't bad things. God certainly can move through those things. God can work through those things. But I'm just pointing out that there's a different kind of sound when your only hope is on God. Your only hope is, God, I need you to do a miracle. I need you to do the impossible. And that's the situation we find this widow in. And so she comes up to Elisha and she's like, I need a miracle. Here's the situation. And God, you need to help. And this is such an interesting story because God doesn't show up on the scene in the way that maybe we would expect him to show up or respond through the prophet of Elisha in the way we would expect God to respond to a situation like this. Because, I mean, when you read it, it's like you sort of expect that somehow that God's just going to, kind of through Elisha, just sort of provide, just write a check to the widow and call it all good, or like, hey, I feel your pain. It's horrible. Let me take care of this. Let me deal with all this. I mean, that's kind of what you expect. You expect that need to get taken care of right then and right there in the way that we expect. And by the way, I mention that because, so often, isn't it amazing how oftentimes when God doesn't answer our prayers the way we expect it, we just sort of assume that he didn't answer the prayer. Like we like to kind of go with that Garth Brooks theology, thank God for unanswered prayers. But truth is, there's really no such thing as an unanswered prayer. God always answers your prayer. It's just not the way you might always expect it to happen. And listen, here's why that's powerful. It's because, listen, if God always answered your prayer just the way you expected it, that's all you would ever get. But thank goodness we've got a God. When you read of the God of the Bible, he's a God who goes beyond our expectations. See, if he just answered your prayer the way you expected it every time, we would never provide the opportunity for him to move and work in our lives beyond our expectations. And we serve a God who is a beyond expectations God. Think of Ephesians 3:20, to him who is able to do infinitely more than we could ever hope or ever imagine or even ask. That's the kind of God that we serve. And so she's going into this. She's got her set of expectations, and yet in a way that she's expecting God's going to show up, a way she's expecting Elisha to respond to her. And yet I find it so interesting, so intriguing how Elisha actually responds to her. This is the response. Again, not probably what she was expecting, maybe even hoping for in that moment. He says, how can I help you? You think, okay, this is good. She's like, you can write a check to a widow with a couple kids and needing some real help right now, and send it in the mail to such and such place, But he just kind of moves right on there. Doesn't even really let her answer. He goes on, he says, tell me, what do you have in your house? What do you have in your house? See, what's he getting at here? This is actually, I think, one of the biggest obstacles of why so many of us struggle to actually create space for God to move in our lives, is this part right here. Because notice what he challenged. Notice the challenge that he issues to her. It's beyond her expectation. The challenge is listen, hey, I know you're praying. I know you've been praying for this. I know you've been praying for God to do more. But the challenge is, have you prepared for what you're praying for? Have you prepared for what you are actually praying for? Because again, so many of us, we prepare for the worst when it comes to prayer. Like if God doesn't show up the way we expect him to show up. But when was the last time you actually prayed for God to do more than you expected? When was the last time you actually went into prayer and your preparation matched your expectation? You expected that, and listen, God is going to show up and God is going to move in a way so much more than I could ever hope or imagine or even plan out on my own. And you actually prepared for that. You prepared for that. See, and this is important because I really believe a lot of times, so often, again, we have a God who goes beyond what we oftentimes expect, but he's never going to actually, more often than not, he never moves beyond our level of preparation. You've got to prepare for what you're expecting and how you're expecting a God to move in your life. Preparation reveals expectation, and it's so important. So often you'll be people, I'll be in conversation with, it's like, oh, I'm praying for a new job, and it's like, that's great, but are you preparing for what you're praying for? Like did you actually fill out the application? Did you actually go to the interview? Did you actually dress up for it? Are you preparing for what you're praying for? Or the ladies or the guy, I should say, that's hoping to find Mrs. Right. I'm praying for Mrs. Right so I can get married and have a family, and yet he goes out living a single life and doing everything that a not married man would be doing, right? And again, the question becomes, are you preparing for what you're praying for? It's a really challenging question when you really think about it. And that's really the challenge that Elisha puts out to her. Listen, if you want to make more space for God to move, you've got to start preparing for what you're praying for. And so how do we do that? How do we prepare for what we're praying for? Well, here's the first thing we see is that we prepare for more. We prepare for God to show up, for God to do more than maybe we could expect or hope for. We prepare for more when we recognize what we've already got. We prepare for more when we recognize what we've already got. In other words, you got to start by taking an inventory. Where did Elisha start? When he was challenging her to prepare for what she's praying for, where did he start? He started with what was in her house. Take an inventory of what you've already got. I know you're believing for more, you're praying for more, you're hoping for more, but listen, before God's going to move, before God starts to take a step to provide for you in the way that you're hoping for and praying for, listen, you've got to start by taking an inventory. It starts with this attitude of gratitude, of focusing not on what you don't have, but on what you do have. In fact, I put on my notes this way, is that the door to more, it always starts with gratitude. It always starts with gratitude. It always starts with praise. It always starts with appreciation for where God is already working and moving in your life. There's always an inventory before there's an increase. Because listen, God's work in our lives is always an inside job. It's always an inside job. It starts on the inside and it ultimately works its way out. And it doesn't mean that your circumstances on the outside are going to instantly change. What it means, though, is that I'm going to do something on the inside of me. When I have gratitude, when I focus on where God's working and moving in my life, and there's a spirit of appreciation, there's a spirit of praise there. When I focus on what I already have inside of me, allow Him to do a work inside of me, it'll eventually affect the outside of my life. It will. So many times we get this backwards. We think, oh, well, I need a job. I need my job to change to make me happy. I need this outside experience or something to change for me to really find fulfillment, to find happiness, to find significance. Or I need someone else in my life to fill this void. No, the starting place, it's always an inside job. You got to start with what you got, not always focusing on what you don't have. And again, it can be incredibly tough when you're in a season of want. And you're in a season of need, and you're like, man, it just feels like all you can see is what you don't have rather than what you do have. And yeah, I'm telling you, the door to more, it always starts with gratitude. I like how David puts it in Psalm 23, verse 5 through 6. He says, "You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." I love that. Notice that picture of gratitude as he focused on God's goodness, God's grace, God's mercy, God's love in his life. And notice how it's goodness and mercy, it literally tracks him down. Again, gratitude, the door to more. You want to see and make room for God to move in your life. You want to have more things to give thanks for in your life. It starts with giving thanks for the things that are already in your life, the people already in your life. God is already working and moving in your life. The more we choose to say thank you, the more we have to say thank you to in life. In fact, I was thinking about this when it comes to like my boy, every once in a while, we'll be walking through a store and he's like, "Oh, I just need this toy. This toy will change my life. I need this Star Wars Lego or this Jurassic Park, Jurassic World Lego." And inevitably, the conversation will kind of go into, like, none of my toys are any good. Like, I have no good toys. I got nothing to play with. If I just had this, and I mean, if you're a parent or grandparent, like nothing causes you to not want to get that toy for them than a lack of gratitude, right? This lack of appreciation, not seeing what they already have. And of course, in those moments, it's like I want to take him to his toy closet, which looks like a small Toys R Us, and just like, hey, let's start working through these toys that you seem like you don't care about or you don't want anymore, and let's give them away, which we never get very far with that. But how many know on the flip side of that, though, when my boy comes to me and he's thankful. He's thankful for what he has. He's thankful for the toys he's got. And he's like, "Man, I'm just, thank you guys. Thank you, Mom and Dad." It's amazing. Like, I'll get him anything and everything he wants, right? Like, whatever you want, buddy. You want the new car? Okay, maybe you're still years from that. So, but man, I'll give him just about anything he wants. It's amazing how gratitude, it's just kind of primes the pump of generosity. I mean, and so it's so important. It's so important. And again, like I said, it can be tough when you're in those moments where it doesn't feel like you've got much to be thankful for. And certainly this widow, that was her situation. She was in a tough situation. She was in a tough, place. And again, gratitude, though, it's so important because I think oftentimes, speaking of expectations of how God's going to move, how God's going to work in our lives, we typically expect God's going to answer our prayers and deal with our situation through the process of addition. But in reality, is God most oftentimes is a God of multiplication. He loves to multiply. Oftentimes the things and the situation, the stuff that we have already in our life, he loves to multiply what's already in our hand. I think of the little boy, the fish and loaves, and multiplying it for the thousands, right? He loves to take what we got and multiply it. And listen, few things are a greater multiplier than gratitude. Gratitude multiplies. See, gratitude actually, it can multiply a blessing in our life by sustaining it well beyond its expiration date. Do you realize that? Like gratitude, like you can be blessed one time, like something great happens in your life. And what gratitude does, when we choose to be thankful for that blessing, we choose to kind of think back on that and give praise for that, is those feelings, those emotions that come with that moment of gratitude, that moment of thankfulness. It's amazing how it just kind of comes back again. I was thinking of this like when I was on I don't spend a lot of time on Facebook, but when I do bring up Facebook, one of the first things that pops up is kind of the memory picture. And so you'll see this picture of kind of a highlight that you posted maybe 3 years ago or 4 years ago, 5 years ago. It's amazing when I see that picture, all those great feelings, all those great emotions kind of come back again. This thing that was such a blessing back then is just as much a blessing now when I look back at it. And that's what gratitude is. When you choose to give thanks, choose to give praise, even when you don't feel like it, even when you might not feel like you've got a whole lot to give praise and thanks for. When in 1 Thessalonians says, when you give thanks, even in tough circumstances, in all circumstances, it's amazing how his goodness, his mercy, it chases you down. Your eyes are opened up to the goodness and the blessing of God. And again, it's so important because if you can't recognize it, if you can't have gratitude, he can't multiply it. And if he can't give thanks for it, he can't multiply, he can't do what he's wanting to ultimately do in and through your life when it comes to making space, making room for the very blessings of God in your life. In fact, I put it this way. It says, God says, listen, he'll give us more, but you got to first take an inventory. Again, it starts with this whole idea of taking an inventory, being grateful, being thankful for what we got. But here's the thing, is again, what's an inside job? It starts what was inside. It started with what was inside our house. Listen, it wasn't meant to stop there. Gratitude's key. It starts with gratitude. It starts with praise. It starts with recognizing what you already have in your life, taking an inventory. But while, again, it started with what was inside our house, it wasn't meant to stop there. And too often, that's where it stops for a lot of us. When it comes to making space, making room for God to move in our lives, this is where it stops. But yet, notice what happens here. Verse 3, notice Elisha's instructions. Elisha said, go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it one aside. Again, kind of a crazy request when you think about it. I mean, think about this. I mean, imagine if you did that tonight. Like you decided, God calls you to go and collect a whole bunch of jars and pots and pans for your neighbors. I mean, kind of a crazy request. I mean, imagine going to your neighbor like, hey, I could really use a pot